Picture this. A 9-year-old girl steps out into a bitter winter morning, carrying 2 cans of fruit as a gift for her favorite teacher. 6 blocks. That's all that separated her from school. She never made it. For nearly 6 decades, her killer walked free, living just 6 blocks from her grieving family, looking out his window every day at the cemetery where she was buried. And when justice finally came, it arrived with a number so staggering it defies imagination. 1 in 480 septillion. This is the story of Maureene Chiverella, and how the ghost of a 58-year-old crime was finally brought into the light. Before we dive into this haunting journey through time, I want to ask you to do something. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that no victim should ever be forgotten, no matter how many decades pass, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these forgotten cases back into the light where they belong. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from today. It's incredibly powerful to see how these stories connect people across the world, even decades after the crimes occurred. Welcome to Echoes of Crime Files. I'm your host, and today we're going back to March of 1964, to a small Pennsylvania coal town where innocents died on a Wednesday morning, and where a family's prayers would echo for more than half a century before they were finally answered. Long before her name appeared in police files, before it was whispered in hushed tones across a grieving community, before it became synonymous with one of Pennsylvania's longest-running mysteries, Maureene Chiverella was simply a child, a daughter, a sister, a girl who dreamed of becoming a nun, and who filled her family's modest home with music from a Sears catalog organ. She entered the world on Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1954, in Waterloo, New York. The second of 5 children born to Carmen and Mary Chiverella, Maureene arrived into a family that embodied the values of working-class Italian-American life. In the 1950s, faith, family, hard work, and an unshakable belief that if you kept your head down and treated people right, the world would be a safe place for your children. Carmen Chiverella, Maureene's father, had ties to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Mary, her mother, came from Hazleton, a city nestled in the heart of Pennsylvania's anthracite coal region. After spending several years in upstate New York, building their young family, Carmen and Mary made a decision that would ultimately place them at the center of one of the most tragic stories in Pennsylvania history. They decided to return home, back to Mary's roots, back to Hazleton. They arrived in the early 1960s, settling into the northwest section of a city still deeply defined by its coal mining heritage. Hazleton sat in the heart of the anthracite region, a place where generations of families had built their entire existence around the rhythmic, grueling cycles of the mines. By the time the Chiverellas arrived, the industry was already in decline. The Knox mine disaster of 1959 had essentially rung the death knell for anthracite coal in Pennsylvania. But the culture the mines had forged remained as strong as the bedrock beneath the city streets. This was a community built by immigrants. Germans and Irish had arrived in the 1840s, followed by waves of Italians, Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, Slovaks, and Montenegrins, all drawn by the promise of work deep beneath the earth. By 1964, Hazleton was a tapestry of ethnic neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors were as close as blood relatives, and where the Catholic Church served as the undisputed backbone of social and moral life. The Chiverellas settled into this tight-knit world with purpose. Carmen operated the Little Market, a neighborhood grocery store located directly next to their home at 533 Alter Street. The work was relentless. Carmen would rise before the sun even considered breaking the horizon, picking up supplies and preparing for a day that would stretch from 10 in the morning until 10 at night, 7 days a week. When he finally locked the doors each night, his work wasn't done. He'd spend his late-night hours hunched over the books, managing the accounts by lamplight. Mary contributed to the family's modest income by working at one of the downtown knitting mills, joining the ranks of local women who powered an economy transitioning away from its industrial past. The mills were demanding in their own right long hours, repetitive work, the constant clatter of machinery. But Mary never complained. This was what families did. This was how you built a life. Despite the long hours, both parents worked. Despite the economic pressures that weighed on working-class families in a region still reeling from industrial decline, the Chiverella children, Maureene, Ronald, Carmen Marie, and their younger siblings lived a childhood defined by love, structure, and tradition. Sundays were held sacred in the Chiverella household. Carmen would close the little market for exactly 1 hour around lunchtime, the only 60 minutes during the entire week when the family could sit together around the table. These Sunday mornings always began the same way, with Mass at either St. Joseph's or Most Precious Blood Church. The family would file into the pews, heads bowed, following the rhythms of Catholic liturgy that had been passed down through generations. For the Chiverellas, faith wasn't just a Sunday obligation, it was the foundation of everything. And for young Maureene, that faith ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. She was a gentle child, small for her age, with bright blue eyes that seemed to hold an unusual depth of understanding for someone so young. Her dark hair framed a face that was almost always smiling, almost always looking for ways to help, to serve, to make others happy. She was the kind of child who instinctively put others first, who found genuine joy in the simple pleasures, playing school with her siblings, tinkering on that Sears organ her parents had saved up to buy for her, composing little songs with her older brother Ronald. Maureene frequently told her family that when she grew up, she was going to become a nun. It wasn't said with the casual whimsy of childhood fantasy. When Maureene talked about her calling, she spoke with quiet certainty. Her family never doubted her. It felt entirely consistent with who she was. Selfless, devoted, drawn to service. She shared a bedroom with her younger sister, Carmen Marie, whom she had affectionately nicknamed Dune. At night, after the house had settled into stillness, the two girls would brush each other's hair, surrounded by the faces of 1970s heartthrobs, David Cassidy, Ricky Nelson, whose photographs covered their walls. They would whisper and giggle, making plans for the future, dreaming the dreams that 9-year-old girls dream. The daily routine in the Chiverella household was as predictable as it was comforting. Carmen would be at the store before dawn broke. Mary would head to the mill, and the children would walk together, always together, the 6 blocks to St. Joseph's parochial school, where nuns in traditional habits provided an education steeped in Catholic doctrine and moral clarity. In Hazleton, everyone knew everyone. Doors were left unlocked. Children played in the streets until the streetlights flickered to life. The most shocking news in the neighborhood usually concerned someone's tomato garden or the success of a church fundraiser. It was, by all outward appearances, a safe place to raise children. But beneath that veneer of small-town safety, beneath the assumption that nothing truly terrible could happen in a place where everyone knew your name, a darkness was beginning to stir, and it was about to shatter the innocence of an entire community. Wednesday, March 18th, 1964. The day began like every other day in the Chiverella household. At 4:30 in the morning, the alarm clock shattered the pre-dawn silence. In the bedroom she shared with her sister, Maureene stirred first. She rolled over carefully, mindful not to disturb Carmen Marie, and whispered something that would later become one of her sister's most treasured memories. "Close your eyes, Dune," she said softly. "I'm going to turn on the light to get my clothes." It was such a small act of consideration, such a tiny gesture of kindness. But it was quintessentially Maureene, always thinking of others first, even in the mundane moments of an ordinary morning. She rose quietly and began selecting her outfit for the day. A dark jacket, a matching skirt, black leotards to protect against the March cold. She slipped a silver ring with a small diamond onto her finger. She fastened her earrings, and then she reached for the necklace, the yellow gold chain with the 1-inch cross that her father had given her just 3 months earlier for her 9th birthday. It had quickly become her most treasured possession. She wore it everywhere, to school, to church, every single day. But this wasn't just an ordinary Wednesday morning. Maureene had a mission. One of the nuns at St. Joseph's, Sister Josephine, was celebrating a feast day, and Maureene wanted to honor her with a gift. She padded quietly through the house and into her father's store, where she carefully selected 2 cans from the shelves, pears and beets. Simple gifts, but chosen with care, and wrapped in the pure intention that defined everything Maureene did. Because she wanted to drop the cans off in her classroom before attending daily mass, Maureene made a request that morning that broke from the usual routine. She asked her parents if she could walk to school alone. Under normal circumstances, Maureene always made the 6-block journey to St. Joseph's parochial school with her brothers and sisters. The school was less than half a mile away, but she had never made the walk by herself. Not once. That morning, though, she had a purpose. She wanted to arrive early enough to leave her gifts for Sister Josephine and still make it to Mass on time. Her internal clock was set to the rhythm of the church bells, and she couldn't afford to be late. Carmen and Mary considered the request. They looked at their daughter responsible, mature beyond her years, devoted, and they agreed. It was 6 blocks. In broad daylight, in a neighborhood where they knew every family, every storefront, every face. What could possibly happen? Between 7:50 and 8 o'clock in the morning, Maureene gathered her belongings, her school bag, her pocketbook, the 2 heavy cans of fruit. She wrapped her multicolored scarf, a babushka, they called it, around her head to protect herself from the bitter wind that had been howling through Hazleton all week. Dressed in her dark jacket and skirt, black leotards, and suede shoes, Maureene Chiverella stepped out of the warmth and safety of 533 Alter Street and into the cold morning air. She would never return. The wind that morning was absolutely relentless, a fierce, gusty force that seemed determined to push back anyone who dared venture outside. Maureene, small for her 9 years, had to lean into it as she made her way along the northern sidewalk, clutching her school bag in one hand and the canned goods in the other. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, she reached the area near 212 West 4th Street, close to a location known as Sherman Court. It was here that she was spotted by Helen Slattery, her mother's cousin. Helen happened to glance out her window and saw the little girl hustling eastward, her head tucked against the gale, moving with clear purpose. Maureene was only 1 block west of Church Street, what the locals called Route 309, and she seemed entirely focused on her destination. The cold was so severe that Helen briefly considered opening her door to call Maureene inside, just for a few minutes, just to give the child a chance to warm up before continuing her journey. But before Helen could act, Maureene had moved on, disappearing around the corner. Helen wasn't the only one who noticed the lone figure struggling against the elements. Several other neighbors observed Maureene that morning. Some even called out to her, offering shelter from the wind. Each time, Maureene politely declined. She was a child, defined by her sense of duty and responsibility. She had a mission to complete. She had to get to school. She had to deliver her gifts. She had to make it to Mass on time. She pressed on, her small frame battling the wind, disappearing from the view of the neighborhood witnesses as she approached the final blocks toward St. Joseph's. And then, somewhere between the familiar streets of her neighborhood and the safety of her school, Maureene Chiverella vanished. At St. Joseph's parochial school, Maureen's seat remained empty. Her teacher, following the routine of the day, marked her attendance records accordingly. Absent. Through the first hour, and then the second, the assumption remained straightforward. The bitter weather had perhaps kept the young girl at home, or a sudden illness had intervened. There was no immediate alarm. In 1964, the absence of a student was a matter that usually waited until the end of the day or the arrival of a parent's explanatory note. No phone call was made to the Chiverella household. There was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Not yet. The true gravity of the situation didn't crystallize until the lunch hour. It was the custom of the Chiverella children to walk home for their midday meal, a brief return to warmth and family before heading back for the afternoon session at school. This was a daily ritual, as predictable as the rising sun. When the door to 533 Alter Street opened at lunchtime that Wednesday, Ronald, the eldest of the children, and Carmen Marie stepped inside, stomping the cold from their feet, ready for whatever warm meal their mother had prepared. But Maureene wasn't with them. Carmen Chiverella looked past his two children, his eyes instinctively scanning the street beyond, expecting to see Maureen's dark hair and her multicolored scarf appear on the sidewalk just behind them, as it always did. As it had done every single school day, for as long as he could remember. Instead, there was nothing. The street remained still, empty, silent, except for the howling wind. "Where's your sister?" he asked, his voice carrying the first edge of concern. Ronald and Carmen Marie exchanged glances. They didn't know. They hadn't seen her at school that morning. They had assumed she was at home, sick or kept back by their mother for some reason. Carmen felt his stomach tighten. He clung to the hope that this was nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. Maybe Maureene had stayed after at school for some activity. Maybe she had lost track of time while praying in the chapel. Maybe she was helping one of the nuns with a task and had simply forgotten to tell anyone. He told Ronald and Carmen Marie to finish their lunch quickly and return to St. Joseph's immediately. And when they got there, they were to find Maureene and bring her straight home. Following her father's instructions, Carmen Marie went directly to Maureen's homeroom teacher as soon as she arrived back at school. The conversation was brief, and the response was immediate and chilling. The teacher confirmed what the attendance records already showed. Maureene had never arrived that morning. She had been marked absent from the very start of the school day. She had never walked through the door. She had never sat at her desk. She had never delivered her gifts to Sister Josephine. She had never attended Mass. Maureene Ann Chiverella had simply disappeared somewhere between 533 Alter Street and St. Joseph's Parochial School. The realization hit Carmen Chiverella with the force of a physical blow. Something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. He didn't wait for more information. He didn't debate the possibilities. He immediately launched into a frantic search of the neighborhood, his mind racing through every conceivable scenario, while his heart pounded with a dread he couldn't name. He retraced the route Maureene should have taken, his eyes scanning every alleyway, every porch, every doorway, every shadowed corner. He went to St. Joseph's Church, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and searching the pews, the quiet corners of the sanctuary, the places where a small girl might sit and pray and lose track of time. Nothing. No sign of her. He began knocking on doors, his voice growing more desperate with each unanswered question. "Have you seen a 9-year-old girl? Dark hair, dark jacket, carrying a school bag, door after door, neighbor after neighbor." The answers were all the same. "No. Sorry. Haven't seen her." Carmen's search was interrupted when one of the neighborhood women called out to him from her doorway. She had seen the desperation etched across his face. She had heard him calling his daughter's name into the wind. When Carmen confirmed who he was looking for, the woman's expression shifted. The color drained from her face. Her hand went to her mouth. "If you're looking for the little girl," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of what she was about to say. They found her. The location wasn't on the route to school. It wasn't anywhere within the familiar, safe confines of the neighborhood where Maureene had spent her entire life. Approximately 3 miles away from the Chiverella home, in Hazleton Township, there lay an abandoned coal-stripping pit. It was a jagged scar on the landscape, a brutal reminder of the region's anthracite mining past, a place that had long since been abandoned and had devolved into an illegal dumping ground for refuse and garbage. Tucked away near the Hazleton Municipal Airport, off a desolate stretch of Airport Road, the pit was a place of gray earth, churned soil, and discarded waste. It was isolated, remote, the kind of place where someone could do terrible things without being seen or heard. Just after 1 o'clock that afternoon, a man arrived in the area to give his 16-year-old nephew a driving lesson. He had specifically chosen these quiet back roads to allow the nervous teenager to practice without the pressure of traffic or the judgment of other drivers. As the boy carefully navigated the rutted terrain, trying to master the basics of steering and acceleration, something caught their attention in one of the old mining pits. At first glance, it appeared to be a large doll discarded among the trash. A splash of blue fabric, a small form lying motionless against the dark, churned earth. But something about it didn't look quite right. Curiosity gave way to a sickening, creeping dread. The man told his nephew to stop the car. He got out, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, and approached the edge of the pit. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, lying among the debris of the abandoned coal stripping, wasn't a doll. It was a child, a little girl, lying perfectly still. The man scrambled down the slope, his heart hammering in his chest, praying that somehow, impossibly, the child might still be alive. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her arm. To his absolute horror, the small body was still warm. The realization of what he had found crashed over him. He turned and ran back to his car, nearly falling in his haste, and immediately contacted the Pennsylvania State Police. Within minutes, the desolate quiet of the dumping ground was shattered by the arrival of police vehicles, their sirens cutting through the cold afternoon air. Investigators descended on the scene. Patrol cars blocked off the access roads, and following the customs of the time, priests from St. Joseph's Church also arrived, summoned to administer last rites. When one of the clergymen looked down into the pit, when his eyes fell upon the small, still form lying at the bottom among the refuse, his face went pale. His breath caught in his throat. He recognized her instantly. To the absolute heartbreak of the community and the complete devastation of the Chiverella family, he positively identified the body as Maureene Chiverella, the little girl who had left her home that morning, carrying canned fruit for her teacher, the girl who had never made it to school, the girl who would never grow up to become the nun she had dreamed of being. If this story is affecting you the way it's affecting me in the telling of it, I want to ask you to do something. Take a moment right now to hit the like button on this video. Leave a comment, even if it's just to say where you're watching from, or to share your thoughts on this case. These small actions help this story reach more people. They help ensure that Maureen's name is never forgotten. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. We cover cases like this every single week, and your subscription means we can continue bringing these important stories to light. The scene at the base of the stripping pit was a stark and haunting contrast to the domestic warmth Maureene had left behind only hours earlier. As investigators carefully descended the slope, their shoes sliding on the loose earth, they found the 9-year-old girl lying among the discarded refuse. Her small body, so full of life and faith and purpose just that morning, was now the focal point of absolute tragedy. She remained fully clothed in the dark jacket and skirt she had so carefully selected for school. Her black leotards were still intact, but her feet were bare. Her suede shoes had been removed and were discovered a short distance away, discarded near the other remnants of her morning journey like trash. Strewn about the gray earth were the items that represented her final, innocent errands. Her school bag, her pocketbook, and the 2 tins of food she had so carefully selected from her father's market, the pears and the beets, chosen with love and intended as a simple gesture of kindness for Sister Josephine. Now they sat as silent witnesses in the dirt, their labels fading in the pale afternoon light. The brutality of Maureen's final moments was written clearly in the evidence before them. Her wrists had been bound together tightly. Her ankles were similarly secured. The bindings used were her own shoelaces, stripped from her suede shoes and repurposed as makeshift restraints. To ensure her silence, to muffle any cries for help, the attacker had taken her multicolored scarf, the babushka she had wrapped around her head, to protect herself from the bitter wind, and had used it as a gag. It had been forced so deep into her mouth and down her throat that the sheer violence of the act had knocked out one of her teeth. The physical evidence on her small body told the story of a struggle that had been as brief as it was violent. She had been struck twice on the crown of her head, once on her right temple, blows likely intended to disorient her, to incapacitate her, to make her easier to control. Around her neck, the unmistakable marks of manual pressure were clearly visible. Finger marks, the impression of hands that had squeezed the life from a 9-year-old child. The following day, an autopsy was conducted at Hazleton State General Hospital. The examination provided cold, clinical confirmation of what the investigators already knew in their hearts. The medical examiner's findings revealed that Maureene had been subjected to a horrific assault prior to her death. The official cause was recorded with brutal simplicity: asphyxiation and strangulation. Maureene Chiverella had been choked to death in the isolated quiet of that abandoned stripping pit, alone and terrified, far from the warmth of her home and the safety of her family. But amid all the horror, amid all the evidence of evil, the perpetrator had inadvertently left behind a singular piece of evidence that would, decades later, become the key to solving the case. Traces of biological fluids were discovered on Maureen's dark jacket, stains that told the story of what had been done to her. In 1964, however, those stains were simply a grim detail to be documented and photographed. The field of forensic genetics didn't exist yet. Though James Watson and Francis Crick had modeled the double helix structure of DNA 11 years earlier, in 1953, the revolutionary idea that a person's unique biological blueprint could be used to identify them in a criminal investigation remained purely theoretical. It was the stuff of science fiction. To the investigators standing in that pit in March of 1964, the biological evidence was noted, preserved, and filed away. They could determine a basic blood type, A, B, AB, or O, but they couldn't isolate a specific individual from a population of millions. They had no way of knowing that the evidence they were carefully preserving would, 57 years later, point directly to Maureen's killer with a probability so staggering it would make headlines around the world. All they knew in that moment was that a child was dead, a family was destroyed, and a community would never be the same. As news of what had happened to Maureene rippled through Hazleton, the town's very identity began to fracture and transform. This was a community that had been built by immigrants. Germans and Irish had arrived in the 1840s, drawn by the promise of work. They were followed by successive waves of Italians, Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, Slovaks, and Montenegrins, people who had crossed an ocean to toil deep beneath the Pennsylvania earth, extracting the anthracite coal that would power America's Industrial Revolution. By 1964, the coal industry was in its death throes. The Knox mine disaster of 1959 had essentially ended deep mining in the region. But the community spirit, the cultural bonds forged in those generations of shared struggle, had remained resilient and strong. Hazleton was still a place where children played outside until the streetlights flickered to life, where doors were left unlocked, where the idea of a child walking 6 blocks to school alone was considered not just safe, but utterly mundane, a normal part of growing up. The loss of Maureene Chiverella shattered that illusion completely. The day after her body was discovered, Hazleton Mayor Joseph Conahan, a man who lived just 1 block from Alter Street, whose own children had been playmates of the Chiverella siblings, issued a somber statement to the shaken public. He declared that what had happened had made everyone in the community cognizant of the constant presence of evil in the world. He acknowledged the painful reality that heinous crimes could happen anywhere, even in their own backyard, even in a place as close-knit and family-oriented as Hazleton. The funeral was an event of staggering proportions. The lines of mourners at the viewing stretched far beyond the doors of the funeral home, winding down the street and around the corner. It seemed as though the entire city had turned out to pay their respects, to share in the collective grief, to try to make sense of the senseless. When the time came to close the casket for the final time, Maureene Chiverella leaned over her daughter. She pressed her lips to Maureen's cold forehead for one last farewell kiss. It was a moment of profound, soul-crushing finality, the beginning of a life sentence of what-ifs and unanswered questions for the family. If only they hadn't let her walk alone. If only she had left a few minutes earlier or later. If only someone had been watching more carefully. If only. If only. If only. Maureene was laid to rest in St. Joseph's Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery, her small casket lowered into the earth as her family stood in the cold, their tears falling like rain. She left behind her parents, Carmen and Mary, and her 4 siblings, Ronald, Carmen Marie, and the younger children, all of them forced now to face a world that felt fundamentally more dangerous than it had just one morning before. The innocence of childhood had died along with Maureene that day, and Hazleton would never be quite the same. In the early days of the investigation, police cast a wide net, looking for any possible connection to similar crimes. They investigated a potential link to the 1962 case of 9-year-old Carol Ann Doherty in Bristol, Pennsylvania. Carol Ann had been found in the choir loft of St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church. The similarities were chilling. Both 9 years old, both Catholic schoolgirls, both lost in similar circumstances. And there was one more curious detail. On the night before Maureen's death, approximately 1,000 people from Bristol had been in Hazleton for a high school basketball playoff game. Could the same person be responsible for both tragedies? Investigators pursued the lead with intensity, but ultimately, no connection could be established. The cases, despite their surface similarities, appeared to be unrelated. This dead end, however, only served to intensify the pressure on the Pennsylvania State Police. With the 1962 case of Carol Ann Doherty still lingering as a painful and very public unsolved matter, and now with Maureen's case dominating headlines across the state, the department felt an overwhelming urgency to show progress, to demonstrate competence, to give a frightened public some sense of safety and closure. 2 high-profile cases involving young girls in the span of just 2 years threatened to completely undermine public confidence in law enforcement. The pressure was mounting from every direction, from the media, from elected officials, from terrified parents, and most of all, from the Chiverella family, who deserved answers. And so, that pressure, that desperate need for resolution, began to focus on a man who lived on the very margins of Hazleton society. His name was Walter Kowalski. Walter Kowalski was a 52-year-old former coal miner who lived in near total isolation. His home, if you could even call it that, was a small, weather-beaten wooden shack that he had crudely assembled himself. It sat on neglected land approximately 1,300 feet from the abandoned coal-stripping pit where Maureen's body had been discovered. For decades, Walter had worked deep underground in the anthracite mines that had once sustained Hazleton. He had breathed the coal dust. He had felt the weight of the earth pressing down above him. He had done the back-breaking labor that built the region. But as the mines closed one by one, and as Walter's health deteriorated, steady employment became impossible. His body, broken by years of hard labor, simply couldn't handle the physical demands anymore. So Walter survived the only way he knew how, by collecting scrap metal and discarded items from the streets and alleyways of Hazleton, trading what he found for small amounts of cash. It was a marginal existence, barely enough to keep body and soul together. To the authorities investigating Maureen's case, Walter Kowalski seemed to fit a certain profile: his proximity to the crime scene, his solitary existence, his constant movement through the neighborhood as he collected scrap, his poverty, his lack of education, his Polish immigrant background. In 1964, in a community desperate for answers, that was enough to make him a person of intense interest. In the days following Maureen's death, investigators paid a visit to Walter's shack. Now, this is where the story takes a troubling turn, one that reveals just how differently the legal system operated in 1964, especially when it came to people living on society's margins. The officers who arrived at Walter's door didn't seek a warrant. They didn't ask for permission to enter. They didn't advise Walter of any rights. In their view, the shack wasn't a legal residence in the conventional sense, but rather a temporary structure erected on what they believed to be public land. With that assumption, whether legally sound or not, they simply walked inside, their uniforms filling the cramped, dim space as Walter stood quietly by, likely confused and intimidated by their presence. They began questioning him about his whereabouts on the morning of Wednesday, March 18th. Walter answered plainly, and without any apparent defensiveness. He admitted that he had indeed headed toward the area of the stripping pit that morning, as he often did while searching for scrap metal. But he explained that he had only gone a short distance before feeling unwell. The cold had gotten to him, his health wasn't good to begin with, and he had begun to feel unsteady on his feet. So he had turned back and spent the remainder of the day resting inside his shack, trying to warm up. As one officer continued asking questions, another let his eyes wander around the interior of the small space. The shack was cluttered with the evidence of Walter's daily existence. Rusted tools, coils of wire, bits of salvaged metal stacked against the walls, the accumulated detritus of a man making a living from other people's discards. And then something caught the officer's attention. Hanging from a rough wooden post near the center of the shack was a small necklace, yellow gold, with a cross pendant that caught what little light filtered through the narrow window. The officer pointed to it. "This necklace looks valuable, doesn't it?" he remarked, his tone carrying an edge that suggested the question wasn't casual at all. Walter followed the officer's gaze and nodded without hesitation. "I found that necklace near the coal pit on Wednesday morning," he said simply. "Someone must have dropped it." The officers exchanged glances, but showed no visible reaction in the moment. One of them made a brief note in his pad. They asked a few more questions, nothing particularly pointed or aggressive, and then they thanked Walter for his time and left the shack as quietly as they had entered. Later that day, investigators contacted Carmen and Maureene Chiverella. They asked them a single, pointed question. Had their daughter owned a gold necklace with a cross? Carmen didn't need time to think. Just 3 months earlier, for Maureen's 9th birthday, he had bought her a yellow gold chain with a 1-inch cross. It had quickly become her most treasured possession. She wore it every single day. To school, to church, even to bed. She had been wearing it the morning she disappeared. With that confirmation, the entire direction of the investigation shifted decisively, and as it would later turn out, tragically. That same evening, police returned to the shack on the edge of town. But this time, they didn't come with questions. Walter Kowalski was taken into custody, arrested for what had happened to Maureene Chiverella. To strengthen their case against Walter, investigators produced a witness who claimed to have seen him near Airport Road around the time in question. The sighting was vague and imprecise, the kind of identification that might not hold up under intense scrutiny. But in the charged atmosphere of 1964 Hazleton, it was enough. A formal indictment soon followed, and Walter Kowalski found himself facing charges that could end his life behind bars. Now, we need to understand the legal landscape of 1964 to truly grasp what happened next. This was a moment of transition in American jurisprudence. Just 1 year earlier, in 1963, the Supreme Court had ruled in Gideon v. Wainwright, guaranteeing the right to legal counsel for indigent defendants. But the reality in rural jurisdictions lagged far behind the law on paper. Walter was never properly advised of his right to remain silent. The Miranda decision, the one that would require police to inform suspects of their rights, was still 2 years away, not coming until 1966. He was questioned aggressively, without an attorney present, by men who already believed they had found their culprit. To the Pennsylvania State Police, Walter represented a resolution to an escalating crisis, a way to reassure a frightened public, a way to finally close the shadow cast by the Doherty case from 2 years earlier, a way to give the Chiverella family the justice they deserved. But there was a fundamental problem. There was no confession. There was no forensic evidence linking Walter to the actual act. No witnesses who had seen him with Maureene. No physical proof beyond the necklace he claimed to have found. Yet the circumstantial case proved persuasive. The proximity of his shack to the crime scene, the necklace found in his possession, the vague eyewitness testimony, and perhaps, most damaging of all, the fact that Walter was an easy target, a poor, uneducated immigrant, living on the margins of society, someone without the means or knowledge to mount an effective defense. A jury heard the evidence and returned their verdict. Guilty. Walter Kowalski was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for a crime he maintained he did not commit. The conviction did not bring the peace the authorities had hoped for. Almost immediately, questions began to surface. A small but vocal group of neighbors who had known Walter for years openly questioned the verdict. They argued that the state had targeted a vulnerable man of Polish descent, someone without the resources to defend himself properly. To them, the case rested on circumstantial evidence inflated by fear and public pressure. They pointed out that finding a necklace near a crime scene didn't prove you committed the crime, it only proved you'd been in the area. And Walter had openly admitted to being in the area that morning, searching for scrap as he did every day. But their voices were drowned out by the collective relief of a community desperate to believe the nightmare was over. For 10 long years, Walter Kowalski remained behind bars, while the truth remained buried somewhere in the files and evidence rooms of the Pennsylvania State Police. And then, in 1974, everything changed. A newly appointed district attorney took office and, as was customary, began reviewing some of the major cases from previous administrations. When he reached the Chiverella file, he started reading through the evidence with fresh eyes. What he found troubled him deeply. The conclusion became unavoidable. There was no direct evidence tying Walter Kowalski to what had happened to Maureene. Only possession of a necklace he claimed to have found. The eyewitness testimony was vague at best. There was no confession, no forensic evidence, no credible motive. The district attorney made a decision that took tremendous courage in the face of public opinion. He moved to vacate the conviction. Walter Kowalski was released from prison, a man irrevocably altered by a decade of wrongful incarceration. He had gone into prison at 52 years old. He emerged at 62, his health even more deteriorated, his spirit broken by 10 years of punishment for a crime he insisted he hadn't committed. The state eventually offered him an out-of-court settlement, a financial acknowledgement of the injustice he had suffered. Walter took the money and quietly left Hazleton, disappearing into obscurity. No one knows what became of him after that. With Walter's departure, the illusion of closure that had sustained Hazleton for a decade collapsed like a house of cards. The shadow returned, the fear returned, and the investigation into what happened to the girl from Alter Street was forced back to square one, unsolved, unanswered, and seemingly unsolvable. Throughout the decades that followed Walter's release, the search for answers never truly stopped. The Chiverella case became something of a rite of passage within the Pennsylvania State Police. Over the years, more than 230 different members of the force would have their names appear somewhere in the case files. Young troopers, just starting their careers, would be assigned to review the evidence. Veteran investigators nearing retirement would take one last look, hoping to spot something everyone else had missed. The case file itself grew to over 5,000 pages, a massive compilation of witness statements, forensic reports, investigative theories, dead-end leads, and the accumulated frustration of generations of law enforcement officers who couldn't solve the puzzle. Year after year, investigators continued to review the evidence. And year after year, the Chiverella family continued to contact police, hoping for updates, praying for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. Inside the Chiverella home on Alter Street, grief became a permanent resident, a shadow that lived in every room, sat at every meal, attended every family gathering. Maureene Chiverella, Maureen's mother, turned her sorrow into quiet, steadfast devotion. She preserved every letter of condolence that had arrived in those terrible days after Maureen's death, every sympathy card, every newspaper clipping, every scrap of paper that mentioned her daughter's name. She kept them all in careful order, as if maintaining this archive could somehow keep Maureen's memory alive, could somehow prevent the world from forgetting. Her eldest son, Ronald, would later recall that for nearly 50 years, half a century, every Sunday dinner and every holiday meal in the Chiverella household ended exactly the same way. When grace was said, when the family bowed their heads in prayer before eating, his mother would always include one final, unwavering petition. The words varied slightly over the years, but the essence remained constant. Lord, please watch over Maureen's soul. Please guide her safely into heaven. And please help the police find the person who did this to our little girl. 50 years. 260 Thanksgivings and Christmases and Easters. Thousands of Sunday dinners. And every single time, Maureene Chiverella ended her prayer the same way, asking God to reveal the truth about what happened to her daughter on that March morning in 1964. Carmen Chiverella, Maureen's father, carried his grief differently but no less deeply. He continued operating the little market for many years, still working those same grueling hours, still serving the same neighbors. But everyone who knew him said something fundamental had changed. The light had gone out of his eyes. He was going through the motions of living, but a part of him had died in that coal-stripping pit, along with his daughter. Carmen passed away without ever knowing who had taken Maureene from him, and his death added another layer of urgency to the family's search for answers. The clock was ticking, and the people who had loved Maureene most were leaving this world without closure. But then, in 2007, 43 years after Maureen's death, science finally began to catch up with the evidence that had been waiting patiently in storage since 1964. The Pennsylvania State Police DNA Laboratory successfully developed a suspect DNA profile from the biological fluids that had been discovered and carefully preserved on Maureen's jacket all those decades ago. Think about that for a moment. Evidence collected in 1964, when the very concept of using DNA to identify criminals was pure science fiction, was now yielding usable genetic information. The investigators who had documented those stains had no idea what they were preserving, but they did it anyway, following proper procedure, never imagining that their careful work would matter nearly half a century later. The first thing investigators did with this newly developed DNA profile was run it against every original suspect from the 1964 files. Every man who had been questioned, every person of interest, every name that had appeared in those 5,000 pages. One by one, they were eliminated. The profile didn't match any of them. The DNA was then entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of convicted offenders and arrestees maintained by the FBI. This database automatically compares profiles, searching for matches, and then they waited. For over 12 years, from 2007 through 2019, the system automatically checked the killer's DNA profile against every new entry in the database. Every month, the computer would run the comparison, searching through millions of profiles for a match. Month after month, year after year, the result was always the same. No match. The killer, it seemed, had either never been arrested for a qualifying offense or had somehow managed to die or disappear before DNA collection became routine in criminal cases. The investigation hit a wall of digital silence, and just when it seemed like the case of the girl from Alter Street might go cold for good, just when it seemed like Maureene Chiverella's prayers might never be answered, the world of forensic science took another leap forward. In 2018, the Pennsylvania State Police forged a partnership that would finally bridge the gap between 1964 and the present day. They reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology company that specialized in something revolutionary called snapshot forensic DNA phenotyping. This was cutting-edge science, the ability to take a DNA sample and predict what the person actually looked like. Using the DNA profile extracted from Maureen's jacket, Parabon's scientists could make educated predictions about the physical characteristics of her killer. They could tell you his ancestry, his hair color, his eye color, his skin tone, even things like freckling and face shape. On March 20th, 2019, 55 years after Maureen's death, the Pennsylvania State Police released a series of composite images to the public. These weren't artist sketches based on witness descriptions. These were computer-generated predictions based purely on genetic data. The analysis predicted a man of European ancestry with dark brown hair and blue or green eyes, fair skin with possible freckling. The public was shown 3 versions of this face, how he likely appeared at age 25, at age 40, and at age 60. The images sparked considerable public interest. Tips began flowing in. People called the police to report men who looked similar. Old suspicions were revived, but none of the leads panned out. The true breakthrough emerged from a different digital frontier, entirely one that would revolutionize cold case investigations across the country. Around the same time the composite images were released, the killer's DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, where people voluntarily share their genetic data to identify biological relatives and trace their family trees. This was the same technique that had been used just 1 year earlier in 2018 to identify the Golden State Killer after decades of terror. It was called Forensic Genetic Genealogy, and it represented a completely new approach to solving cold cases. The search on GEDmatch returned a hit, but it wasn't a direct match. It was distant, a sixth cousin, sharing approximately 53 centimorgans of DNA with the unknown killer. To put that in perspective, you share about 25% of your DNA with a parent or child, 12.5% with a grandparent or sibling, and 6.25% with a first cousin. A sixth cousin shares less than 1%. We're talking about a genetic connection, stretching back 6 or 7 generations to a common ancestor who might have lived in the 1700s. It was a single, fragile thread, but it was a thread nonetheless. And following that thread would require a very specific kind of expertise, someone who understood not just genetics, but genealogy, family trees, migration patterns, and the painstaking work of tracing bloodlines backward through time. That expertise entered the investigation in February 2020 through an unexpected source. Corporal Mark Barron, the Pennsylvania State Police investigator who had become the primary custodian of the Chiverella case file, received an email from a college student named Eric Schubert. Eric was a freshman at Elizabethtown College, majoring in history. But despite his young age, he was only 19 or 20 years old at the time. Eric had been immersed in genealogical research since childhood. It was a passion that had been sparked by his grandmother's adoption. Eric had spent years helping her trace her biological family, and in the process, he had developed extraordinary skills in building and analyzing family trees. Through his work with a genealogy service he had founded called ES Genealogy, Eric had already assisted law enforcement agencies near Philadelphia and Chicago in resolving cold cases using genetic genealogy. Despite being barely out of high school, he had proven himself capable of the meticulous, exhausting work required to trace distant genetic connections. Corporal Barron reviewed Eric's background and credentials. He checked his references. He verified the cases Eric had worked on. And then, he made a decision that would ultimately solve a 56-year-old mystery. He approved Eric's voluntary involvement in the Chiverella investigation. Eric began with a list of approximately 2,000 people who shared a common ancestor with Maureen's unknown killer. 2,000 names. 2,000 potential branches on an enormous family tree stretching back generations. Working up to 20 hours per week from his dorm room at Elizabethtown College, balancing his genealogy work with his coursework as a full-time student, Eric began the painstaking process of constructing family trees. He pored through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, immigration records, military service records, newspaper archives, church baptism records. He was searching for a path, a genealogical trail that would lead from that distant sixth cousin back through the generations to their common ancestor, and then forward again through a different branch of the family tree to someone who had been in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, on March 18, 1964. It was like assembling a massive jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces were missing, and you didn't have the box to show you what the finished picture was supposed to look like. During his research, a specific surname began to emerge with increasing frequency: Palmeno. The name kept appearing in different branches of the tree, connecting back to the same ancestral lines. Interestingly, the name Palmeno was already familiar to the Pennsylvania State Police, though for a completely different reason. A woman named Renata Palmeno had been found dead in Carbon County back in the 1970s, an unrelated case that had also gone cold. But DNA collected from that investigation was still on file, and it helped confirm that Eric was indeed on the correct ancestral track. As Eric's trees grew more detailed and more extensive, investigators began interviewing living Palmeno relatives. They explained what they were doing and why, and they asked if people would be willing to provide voluntary DNA samples to help narrow down the search. Most people agreed. They understood they weren't suspects themselves, they were simply genetic markers that could help triangulate the position of the actual killer within the family tree. In 2020, The Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory established a Y chromosome profile for the suspect. This was crucial because the Y chromosome passes directly from father to son, relatively unchanged, making it possible to trace strict patrilineal descent. If you're male and you commit a crime, your Y chromosome will be virtually identical to your father's, your grandfather's, your great-grandfather's, going back generations. Slowly, methodically, the genetic distance between the known samples and the unknown killer began to close, from a sixth cousin to a fourth cousin, from a fourth cousin to a second cousin, from a second cousin to a half-uncle or first cousin. The pool of suspects was gradually winnowed down. 2,000 names became 500. 500 became 100. 100 became 20. 20 became 10. And finally, after months of exhaustive work, Eric and the investigators had narrowed the possibilities down to just 4 men. 4 men who shared the right genetic markers. 4 men who had the right ancestry. 4 men who had been the right age in 1964. 4 men who had connections to Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Among those 4 names was a man named James Paul Forte, and when investigators began looking into James Paul Forte's background, what they found sent chills down their spines. James Paul Forte had been born on July 21st, 1941, right here in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, which meant that on March 18th, 1964, the day Maureene disappeared, James Paul Forte was 22 years old. He was a 1959 graduate of Hazleton High School. His yearbook described him as a tall, handsome young man with blue eyes who loved baseball and had an undecided future ahead of him. Just another kid from the coal region, trying to figure out what to do with his life. After graduating high school, Forte had enlisted in the United States Army, serving from 1959 until September of 1962. He received an honorable discharge and returned home to Hazleton, where he settled into civilian life. But it was a quiet, solitary existence. Forte worked as a bartender at various establishments around Hazleton. Later, he became a salesman for bar supplies, a job that suited his loner personality, allowing him to make a living while maintaining minimal social connections. He never married. He had no children, no long-term relationships that anyone could remember. He lived alone, worked alone, and seemed to prefer it that way. As investigators dug deeper into Forte's background, they discovered something that made their blood run cold, a geographical proximity to the Chiverella family that was almost impossible to believe. In the years following Maureen's death, Forte had lived at several different addresses in Hazleton: 745 North Laurel Street, 770 North Laurel Street, and most significantly, 118 West 14th Street. Every single one of these addresses was within 6 or 7 blocks of the Chiverella home on Alter Street. But it was that last address, 118 West 14th Street, that was truly chilling. That house sat directly across the street from St. Joseph's Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery, the very cemetery where Maureene Ann Chiverella had been buried in March of 1964. For years, possibly decades, James Paul Forte had lived with a direct, unobstructed view of Maureen's grave. He could have looked out his window every single day and seen the headstone marking the resting place of the 9-year-old girl whose life he had taken, while Carmen and Mary Chiverella visited their daughter's grave, weeping and praying for justice. James Paul Forte may have been watching from his window across the street. While the Chiverella siblings grew up, got married, had children of their own, all the things Maureene would never do, her killer lived just blocks away, a ghost hiding in plain sight. But the most disturbing discovery was still to come. As investigators continued digging through Forte's past, they uncovered an incident that had nearly exposed him years earlier. An incident that, if handled differently by the criminal justice system, might have solved Maureen's case decades ago. On April 3rd, 1974, exactly 10 years after Maureen's death, James Paul Forte met a 23-year-old woman at a bar in Hazleton called the Culprit Lounge. They talked. They had a few drinks. And when the evening was winding down, Forte offered to drive the woman home. She accepted, having no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But Forte didn't drive her home. Instead, he diverted to a remote area called Stockton Mountain Road, an isolated stretch where no one would hear screams for help. There, he attacked her. The assault was brutal and terrifying. The woman fought back as hard as she could, but Forte was stronger. The assault was only interrupted when a passing truck happened to approach the area. The headlights, the sound of the engine, the possibility of a witness. It was enough to make Forte panic. He stopped the attack, got back in the car, and drove the traumatized woman back to downtown Hazleton, where he dropped her off and fled. The woman immediately reported what had happened. Police investigated, and James Paul Forte was arrested and charged with serious offenses: involuntary deviate sexual intercourse and aggravated assault. This should have been the moment. This should have been when Forte's past caught up with him. If he had been convicted on the original charges, if he had been sent to prison, if his DNA had been collected and entered into the system, Maureen's case might have been solved in the 1970s, instead of waiting until 2022. But that's not what happened. In a catastrophic failure of the judicial system, one that would haunt this investigation for decades, Forte was allowed to plead guilty to a drastically reduced charge. Just aggravated assault. A mere slap on the wrist for what he had actually done. On October 2, 1974, Judge Bernard C. Brominski sentenced James Paul Forte to 1 year of special probation and ordered him to pay the victim's hospital bills. That was it. 1 year of probation. No prison time. No DNA collection, because DNA forensics didn't exist yet. No real consequences. James Paul Forte walked out of that courtroom, a free man, and returned to his solitary life in Hazleton, living blocks away from the Chiverella family, his secret safe for another 48 years. Because DNA testing didn't exist in 1974, and because Forte's name had never appeared in the original 1964 investigation files, the connection between the 1974 assault and Maureen's case went completely unnoticed. If investigators had been able to compare the method, the violence, the pattern, they might have seen the similarities, but without DNA, without computers to cross-reference cases, the dots remained unconnected. Forte continued living in Hazleton, facing only one other minor arrest in 1978 for reckless endangerment. Nothing that would flag him as a serious threat. Nothing that would put him back on law enforcement's radar. And then, on May 16, 1980, while working as a bartender at Genetti's Best Western Motor Lodge on Route 309, the 38-year-old James Paul Forte collapsed behind the bar. He suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital but died before doctors could save him. James Paul Forte was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Drums, Pennsylvania, taking his secrets with him to the grave. Or so he thought. By December of 2021, Eric Schubert's genealogical trail had reached its inevitable conclusion. The evidence pointed to James Paul Forte with increasing certainty, but pointing and proving are two very different things, especially in a court of law. The Pennsylvania State Police required final, definitive confirmation that would stand up to legal scrutiny. They needed DNA directly from James Paul Forte himself. There was only one problem. James Paul Forte had been dead for 41 years. Investigators met with the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office to discuss their options. The conversation was extraordinary. They were contemplating something that was as rare as it was dramatic, something that required special court authorization and would generate significant public attention. To secure the evidence they needed, they would have to reach across 41 years of silence and bring James Paul Forte out of the earth. They would have to exhume his body. On January 6, 2022, exactly 41 years, 7 months, and 21 days after Forte had been laid to rest, Pennsylvania State Police investigators executed a search warrant at Calvary Cemetery in Drums, Pennsylvania. The exhumation was conducted with the utmost care and respect, despite what Forte was suspected of having done. Cemetery officials were present. Representatives from the district attorney's office were there. The entire process was documented, photographed, and witnessed to ensure the chain of custody would be unbreakable. As the soil was carefully removed, as the casket was lifted from the ground and opened, investigators sought one final biological link to a March morning in 1964. A tissue sample was obtained from Forte's remains. Even after more than 4 decades in the ground, his body still contained recoverable DNA. The sample was immediately transported to the Pennsylvania State Police DNA laboratory under strict protocols. And then, once again, they waited. The laboratory worked meticulously, extracting whatever genetic material remained, amplifying it, building a profile that could be compared to the evidence from Maureen's jacket. The results reached investigators on February 3, 2022. The DNA profile extracted from James Paul Forte's exhumed remains was compared to the biological stains preserved on the jacket that Maureene Chiverella had worn on the day she died, 57 years, 10 months, and 16 days earlier. The laboratory returned a match probability that was almost incomprehensible in its certainty. 1 in 480 septillion. Let me put that number in perspective for you. A septillion is a 1 followed by 24 zeros. 480 septillion is 480 followed by 24 zeros. It's a number so large that it becomes almost meaningless to the human mind. To put it another way, in the entire history of humanity, approximately 117 billion people have ever lived on Earth. To find another person with the same DNA profile as James Paul Forte, you would have to search through the populations of approximately 4 million planet Earths. The odds were so astronomical that they transcended mere forensic certainty. This wasn't just a match. This was absolute identification. The Y chromosome analysis provided additional confirmation, tracing the patrilineal line with perfect clarity. After 57 years, 10 months, and 16 days of waiting, the search for Maureene Chiverella's killer was finally over. On the morning of Thursday, February 10th, 2022, the Hazleton Township Commons building filled with people representing a generational cross-section of the Hazleton community. There were current investigators, young troopers who had only recently taken up the burden of the Chiverella case. There were retired officers who had worked the investigation decades ago, who had long since left the force but who had never forgotten the little girl from Alter Street. There were members of the media, cameras ready, knowing they were about to witness something historic. And there were the Chiverella siblings, Ronald, Carmen Marie, and their younger brothers and sisters, now in their 60s and 70s, the last living witnesses to a family forever shaped by a March morning in 1964. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator who had lived with the 5,000-page case file for years, who had made solving this case his personal mission, stood before the microphones. Those who were there said they had never seen anything quite like it. This veteran state trooper, a man trained to maintain professional detachment, was visibly shaken. His voice fractured with emotion as he addressed the room. He spoke of the vivid memory this case held for everyone who had grown up in Hazleton's shadow. He admitted that while officers are cautioned against emotional attachment to cases, the story of Maureene Chiverella had become inseparable from the identity of the Pennsylvania State Police. He noted something remarkable: the Pennsylvania State Police had been in existence since 1905, which meant they had spent more than half of their entire organizational history, over a century of law enforcement, investigating this single case. Think about that. Generations of troopers, thousands of investigators, tens of thousands of hours, all devoted to finding justice for one 9-year-old girl. When Corporal Barron finished speaking, he turned the microphone over to the people who mattered most, the Chiverella family. It was Carmen Marie who spoke first, the little sister who had shared a bedroom with Maureene, who had been the last person to see her alive that morning, who had carried the weight of survivor's guilt for nearly 60 years. Her voice was steady as she remembered the sweet, shy girl who practiced her organ and dreamed of becoming a nun. She talked about brushing each other's hair at night, about whispered secrets and shared dreams. And then she said something profound. She explained that her parents, Carmen and Mary, had never sought revenge or punishment. They had never wanted Forte to suffer the way they had suffered. They had asked only for one thing: the truth. They had wanted to know who had taken their daughter. They had wanted to understand why. They had wanted the world to know that Maureen's life had mattered, that she hadn't been forgotten, that someone had been held accountable. "Justice has been served today," Carmen Marie said, her words carrying the weight of nearly 60 years of waiting. "The promise we made to our mother has finally been kept." Ronald then stepped forward to address the room. He spoke of a closure that would never truly be complete. He talked about the what-ifs that still lingered at every family gathering, the nieces and nephews Maureen would never have, the life she should have lived, the nun she might have become. He talked about how James Paul Forte had lived just 6 blocks away for years, close enough to see the cemetery where Maureen was buried, close enough to watch the family mourn while he remained free and unsuspected. And then Ronald did something unexpected. He thanked the Pennsylvania State Police, not just the current investigators, but all 230-plus troopers who had worked the case over the decades. He thanked them for never giving up, for keeping in touch with the family, for treating Maureen not as a cold case number, but as a real child who had been loved and was still missed. He thanked Eric Schubert, the college student who had devoted hundreds of hours to building family trees from his dorm room, whose genealogical expertise had finally connected the dots. And he thanked science, the incredible advancement in forensic genetics that had allowed evidence preserved in 1964 to finally reveal its secrets in 2022. As the press conference continued, reporters asked the inevitable question: could there be other victims? The investigators' response was sobering. Following the announcement of Forte's identification, a woman named Gina Donahue Connors had come forward with a memory from the late 1960s. She described an incident when she and a friend were walking near the corner of 3rd and Alter Streets, the same neighborhood where Maureen had lived. A man in a car had pulled up beside them and tried aggressively to lure them into his vehicle. The girls had refused and run away, frightened but unharmed. Gina hadn't thought about that incident in decades. But when she saw the photograph of James Paul Forte released by the Pennsylvania State Police, she felt her blood run cold. She was convinced, absolutely certain, that she was looking at the man who had tried to lure her into his car all those years ago. Investigators stated publicly what they believed privately. Predators like James Paul Forte rarely strike only once. The level of violence, the planning, the willingness to take such enormous risks, these are not characteristics of a first-time offender. They issued a public call for anyone with information regarding Forte's activities between 1964 and 1980, the 16 years between Maureen's death and his own, to please contact the authorities. How many other women had he approached? How many other attacks had been interrupted or unreported? How many other families might still be searching for answers about disappeared daughters? Those questions may never be fully answered, but the resolution of Maureen's case opened a door to possibilities that hadn't existed before. The resolution of the Maureene Chiverella case marked a historic milestone in American criminal justice. It became the 4th oldest cold case in United States history to be solved through forensic genetic genealogy, and it was the oldest such case in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But more than that, it served as definitive proof of what I call the long game of justice. This case was solved because investigators in 1964, working with the primitive forensic science available to them, had the foresight and the professionalism to properly preserve evidence they didn't fully understand. They documented those biological stains on Maureen's jacket. They photographed them. They stored them carefully. They maintained the chain of custody. They had no idea that 57 years later, that evidence would point to a killer with a probability of 1 in 480 septillion. They were just doing their jobs correctly. But their careful work made justice possible, decades after they had retired or passed away. This case was solved because a 19-year-old college student had the passion, the skill, and the dedication to spend hundreds of hours building family trees, tracing genetic connections back through generations, following a thread so thin, it seemed impossible it would lead anywhere. This case was solved because the Chiverella family never gave up. For 58 years, they kept Maureen's memory alive. They kept contacting the police. They kept believing that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. And most poignantly, this case was solved because Maureene Chiverella prayed every Sunday, every holiday, every family meal for 50 years. She prayed for her daughter's soul, and she prayed for justice. Mary didn't live to see that prayer answered. She passed away in 2014, 8 years before Forte was identified. She went to her grave without knowing the name of the man who had destroyed her family. But her children lived to see it. Her grandchildren lived to see it. And now, everyone who hears this story knows the truth. Maureene Chiverella was not forgotten. Her case was not abandoned, and her killer, though he escaped earthly justice during his lifetime, did not escape identification and exposure. Hazleton, Pennsylvania will never truly return to the era of unlocked doors and children walking to school without fear. The shadow of March 18, 1964 is too long, too dark, too deeply etched into the community's identity. But as that press conference ended on February 10, 2022, as the Chiverella siblings stepped out into the winter air, something fundamental had shifted. The weight of the unknown had finally been lifted. The question that had haunted 3 generations had finally been answered. The miracle that Maureene sought on her way to St. Joseph's Church that morning, carrying her canned pears and beets, wrapped in her babushka, wearing her precious gold necklace, arrived at last. Not in 1964. Not in time to save her life or spare her family decades of anguish, but it arrived nonetheless, carried forward by the relentless advancement of science, the dedication of law enforcement, and the unwavering faith of a mother who refused to stop praying. The story of Maureene Chiverella stands as a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed beyond all reasonable expectation, does not always disappear. It reminds us that every piece of evidence matters, that every case deserves to be worked, and that families deserve answers even when those answers take a lifetime to arrive. It reflects how far we've come in forensic science, from a world where biological evidence could tell us only basic blood types, to a world where DNA can identify a single individual from among billions with near absolute certainty. But it also reveals the devastating costs of failure within our justice system. Walter Kowalski spent 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 10 years stolen from a man whose only real crime was being poor, isolated, and vulnerable. And James Paul Forte, after attacking a woman in 1974 in a manner that mirrored what he'd done to Maureene, was allowed to plead down to a minor charge and walk free. He never spent a day in prison. He lived out his life in the same community where his victim was buried, dying peacefully of a heart attack at 38 years old, never having to answer for what he'd done. These failures matter. They're part of this story too. For the Chiverella family, the answer came too late for Carmen and Mary, the parents, who spent their final years praying for closure they would never receive. But it came in time for Ronald, Carmen Marie, and their siblings. It came in time for them to finally, after nearly 6 decades, know the name of the man who had shattered their family. If this story has moved you, I want to ask you to do a few things right now. First, take a moment to hit that like button. It seems like such a small thing, but it genuinely helps these stories reach more people. It helps ensure that cases like Maureen's aren't forgotten, that the work of investigators like Corporal Mark Barron and genealogists like Eric Schubert is recognized and celebrated. Second, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts on this case. Some of you have written to ask about covering the case of Carol Ann Doherty, the 9-year-old girl from Bristol, Pennsylvania, whose 1962 case was mentioned at the beginning of this story. Her case remains unsolved to this day. If that's something you'd like us to explore in a future episode, let us know in the comments. Your feedback directly shapes what stories we tell. And third, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Echoes of Crime Files and hit that notification bell. We cover cases like this every single week, stories that deserve to be remembered, families that deserve to be heard, and truths that deserve to be told. Your subscription is what allows us to continue this work. It's what keeps these voices from fading into silence. Thank you for watching today's episode of Echoes of Crime Files. Thank you for bearing witness to Maureen's story. Thank you for ensuring that her memory lives on. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a case. We have more stories to tell, more families to honor, and more truths to uncover. Stay safe out there. Hold your loved ones close. And remember, some echoes never fade. Some stories demand to be told, and some prayers, no matter how long it takes, are eventually answered. This is Echoes of Crime Files. Until next time, take care.